Lesson 5. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Memory verse. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. Genesis chapter 19 verse 24 and 25. Text. Genesis chapter 18 verses 1 to 33. Chapter 19 verses 1 to 38. In Genesis chapter 17, the Lord had appeared to Abraham and called him to perfection. In this study, he again appeared to him, in company of two angels in human form, in the plain of Mamre. During the visit, Abraham demonstrated uncommon hospitality to the divine visitors, leaving us an example on how to treat strangers. The New Testament records it thus: "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Distributing to the necessity of saints, given to hospitality. Hebrews 13 verse 2, Romans chapter 12 verse 13. Abraham, being a friend of God, had a close communion with him. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me. And if not, I will know." Genesis chapter 18 verses 17, 20 and 21. God invariably revealed to Abraham that he would destroy the cities because of their wickedness. This made him to passionately intercede for the cities to avert the impending judgment. However, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah had reached a point where divine judgment was inevitable. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Genesis chapter 13 verse 13. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 32. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 9. And chapter 13 verse 19. Jeremiah chapter 49 verse 18. Chapter 50 verse 40. Ezekiel chapter 16 verses 46 to 56. Amos chapter 4 verse 11. Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 9. Matthew chapter 10 verse 15. 11 verse 24. Luke chapter 10 verse 12. Chapter 17 verse 29. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 6. Their judgment serves as warning to restrain anyone who would trifle with divine laws. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication, and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Jude verse 7. Point 1. Abraham's hospitality and intercession for Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis chapter 18 verses 1 to 33. Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 30. Exodus chapter 32 verses 7 to 14. While sitting at his tent door, Abraham saw 3 men stood by him. Apparently, these were divine visitors. He ran to meet them, bowed, and said, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree." Genesis chapter 18 verse 3 and 4. It was customary for people in Bible day to wash the feet of visitors. Genesis chapter 19 verse 2. And chapter 43 verse 24. Abraham, on sighting the strangers, made haste to ensure the washing of their feet, as well as providing a meal. Abraham exemplified the virtue of hospitality to strangers, an act the Lord expects from his children. Jesus underscored the import of this virtue by saying, "I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in." Matthew chapter 25 verse 35. In his letter to Timothy, Paul the Apostle admonished that widows could only be taken into the number, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 10. In the course of his conversation with Abraham, God reiterated his promise that Sarah would conceive and bear a son. Hospitality attracts divine blessings. And he said, "I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and, lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son." And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Genesis chapter 18 verse 10. Sarah laughed within herself when she heard the Lord reaffirm his promise of a son to her, even in old age. Naturally, it seemed too late to have a son, but God is a covenant keeper and his power transcends natural limitations. He gave Abraham a son in spite of the deadness of Sarah's womb. Romans chapter 4 verse 19. There is hope for the barren or anyone who trusts in the Lord. For God is unchangeable. Malachi chapter 3 verse 6. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 8. And the men rose up from thence, and looked toward Sodom. And Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me. And if not, I will know. Genesis chapter 18 verses 16, 20 and 21. Abraham, having heard of the judgment that was going to befall Sodom and Gomorrah, stood in the gap to intercede for the cities. And Abraham drew near, and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Genesis chapter 18 verse 23. The conversation between God and Abraham revealed the righteousness and mercy of God. He is ready to be entreated and unwilling that anyone should perish, though he judges sin because he is holy. In every generation, God seeks men, like Abraham, to stand as intercessors to avert his judgment. Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 30. Abraham was a bold and an importunate intercessor, yet simple in faith. He did not charge God foolishly but interceded in humility and reverence. He said, Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? He knew that the judgment of God was based on righteousness. He might have thought that Sodom and Gomorrah should have at least 50 righteous people to justify their being spared. But 50 righteous people could not be found, and as Abraham continued to reduce the figure, God condescended graciously to his pleas. From the beginning to the end of his intercession, God showed to Abraham and by extension to all mankind, that the judge of all the earth will always do what is right. Really, Abraham's concern in prayer was not only about sparing Lot, his nephew, but over the true nature of God's justice. Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked. And that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Genesis chapter 18 verse 23 and 25. God's response satisfied Abraham and reassured him that he is mindful of the righteous when he judges the wicked. It is also clear that Abraham was a man of unprejudiced love for all people. He was very magnanimous in his request and pleaded for Lot and all the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. This teaches Christians not to pray for their immediate family members only but extend the same to others. I exhort therefore, that, first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks, be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 1 and 2. It is mandatory for believers to pray for the unsaved, Romans chapter 10 verse 1, persecutors, Matthew chapter 5 verse 44, Acts chapter 7 verse 59 and 60, good governance in our nations, 2 Chronicles chapter 6 verses 37 to 39, kings and rulers, Ezra chapter 6 verse 10, 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 1 to 4, one another, James chapter 5 verse 16. The Church, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 23. And the Gospel work, Colossians chapter 4 verse 3 and 4. Ephesians chapter 6 verses 18 to 20. Point 2. Assault and inordinate affection of the depraved Sodomites. Genesis chapter 19 verses 1 to 11. Proverbs 14:12. Chapter 29 verse 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 33. Romans chapter 1 verses 18 to 32. And chapter 11 verse 22. Jude verse 7. Revelation chapter 21 verse 8. Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 15. And there came 2 angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot seeing them rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Genesis chapter 19 verse 1. Lot was sitting in the gate when the heavenly messengers arrived the degenerate city. Sitting at the gate was a sign of prominence and leadership. Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 18. Chapter 21 verse 19. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 23. So, Lot had moved from merely pitching his tent towards Sodom to settling in the city proper and getting involved in the running of its affairs. Evidently, Lot had mixed himself with the wicked men of Sodom, though he still retained some virtues he learnt from Abraham. In spite of his unceremonial departure from Abraham, he still kept to the ethics of entertaining strangers as he had been taught. However, he must have discovered to his chagrin that he had landed himself in a cesspit of spiritual and moral corruption by choosing to live in Sodom. His choice of prosperous-looking Sodom to sojourn ended up becoming a disaster. Pitching one's tent near Sodom could spell doom to any believer who chooses to associate with the world. Well, has the Bible said, "There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death." Proverbs chapter 14 verse 12. Lot was willing to tolerate the evil men of Sodom and their ungodly way of life. This complacency brought tragedy to his family, just as it will to the family of any compromising believer. Like Lot, there are many believers who expose their families to ungodly environments and harmful influences simply because of material profit in business or corporate employment. Such believers are surely setting their families up for avoidable calamities. Consider, for example, the perverting influence of Sodom on Lot's family. First, Lot himself became complacent, unable to persuade anyone in Sodom to know God. Next, his wife turned out to be a worldly, nominal follower of Jehovah. Finally, Lot's daughters became incestuous, shameless and ungodly, thoroughly schooled in the vices of Sodom. Christian parents should beware of exposing their children to the ungodly influences of the present age. The rot in Sodom was pervasive. Men from all quarters besieged Lot's dwelling in an attempt to perpetrate lewdness. Both old and young were involved, and Lot tried in vain to restrain them from their evil intent. Sin knows no tribal, racial or occupational divide. Nor was age a disincentive to iniquity and violence in this depraved city. They shamelessly insisted in committing sodomy with the visitors and called on Lot, "Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them." Genesis chapter 19 verse 5. This shows the abysmal level of depravity into which they had sunk. The men of Sodom, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient. Romans chapter 1 verse 27 and 28. Lot's offer of his daughters to appease the Sodomites is to be condemned. We must never do evil so that good may come out of it. Romans chapter 3 verse 8. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. And they said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee, than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Genesis chapter 19 verses 6, 7 and 9. Despite being under the danger of impending judgment, the immoral Sodomites refused to repent. Not even when they were struck with blindness by the angels. They were hell-bent in their sin, and had reached a point of no return in evil. This marks the characteristics of sinners of all ages who, blinded and hardened by the deceitful glamour of sin, reject God's offer of mercy to continue in their wickedness. Point 3. Absolute destruction of the wicked and impenitent Sodomites. Genesis chapter 19 verses 12 to 38. Revelation chapter 16 verse 9 and 11. Job chapter 31 verse 3. Psalms 9:17. And chapter 11 verse 6. Luke chapter 13 verses 2 to 5. Hebrews chapter 2 verses 1 to 3. Seeing the impenitence and recalcitrance of the Sodomites, the angels instructed Lot to bring out his relations for rescue. This was a unique opportunity for evangelism given to Lot. It is also the command of a great duty which God has placed on every believer. Lot went out, at the angel's bidding, to see to the deliverance of those related to him. Unfortunately, the Sodomites' in-laws treated his warning with levity and scorn. To them, he seemed as one that mocked. In like manner, many fail to respond promptly to the gospel, forgetting that God's judgment is imminent. In evangelizing the lost, our driving force and abiding motto must be that of the Master: I must work the works of him that sent me, while it is day. The night cometh, when no man can work. John chapter 9 verse 4. Many who are repeatedly warned today by faithful ministers of God, but continue in their sins, are rushing headlong into certain destruction. Just as God had warned, payday finally arrived for Sodom and Gomorrah. But before the destruction descended, Lot, his wife and 2 daughters were delivered and urged to escape to the mountains. As soon as Lot was safely out of the way, the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities. The ungodly and the wicked, fornicators and adulterers, idolaters and murderers, together with those who went after strange flesh, were all destroyed by fire. Yes, God is infinite in mercy, slow to anger, eager to forgive. But when people toy with his mercy and continue in sin, he turns around as a consuming fire, instead of a redeeming Savior. For our world, Christ is the city of refuge. Penitent sinners can run to him for safety. In the overthrow of Sodom, though God did not find 10 righteous people as Abraham assumed he would, the righteous was spared the fate of sinners. In like manner, saints will be taken out of the world, in an experience called the rapture, before the great tribulation, when God will rain down his fierce wrath on this present evil world. It is remarkable that Lot and his family escaped the destruction of Sodom, but tragedy struck as they fled to the place of safety. His wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Genesis chapter 19 verse 26. The calamity of Lot's wife proves right the axiom: you can take a worldly person out of the world, but you cannot take the world out of a worldly person. Lot's wife became a pillar of salt because she was unwilling to break away completely from Sodom. She left Sodom, but Sodom was still in her heart. Her fate was recorded to warn us, Luke chapter 17 verse 32. From the example of Sodom and Gomorrah, the wicked are warned to turn away from their unrighteousness. So also by the example of Lot's wife, the righteous are warned not to turn from their righteousness. Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 20, 33 to 13. Backsliding is perilous to the believer's soul. Let us therefore fear, lest, a promise being left us of entering into his rest, Any of you should seem to come short of it. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 1. Instead of going back, we should, like Paul, make up our minds that we will press on to the heavenly prize. Philippians chapter 3 verse 14. The disaster in Lot's family did not end with his wife's instant judgment. The daughters proved they were as depraved as the Sodomites. They barely escaped judgment because of God's mercy in response to Abraham's intercession. As Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and dwelt in a cave together, fearing they might not get husbands, they took turns to commit incest with their father, whom they made drunk prior to the act. Both of them conceived and gave birth to sons who became the fathers of the Moabites and Ammonites respectively. These tribes turned out to be archenemies of Israel in later years, and were barred from God's congregation even to their 10th generation. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3. Lot lost everything, family, property and morals, which is traceable to his decision to separate from Abraham and pitch his tent towards Sodom. His case was that of a righteous man polluted by mingling with the world. At last, Sodom left him a thoroughly ruined man. He was saved as though by fire. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 15. His fate is a warning to everyone to take right decision because it determines one's destiny. Questions for review. 1. What is the spiritual significance of Sodom and Gomorrah to believers today? 2. Why was there a severe judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah? 3. Why is it necessary to intercede for others? 4. Enumerate the dangers of exposing our families to ungodly influence. 5. What should be our evangelistic motto? 6. What can we learn from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the fate of Lot's wife? 7. How can we remain unspotted in a corrupt society?